Let's start with OSPOlogy. OpenSSF and Tutor Group has been collaborating together to create some best practices to help OSPOs be key component for open source sustainability and security. And if you go to the link, you can deep dive more into these best practices to help open source program offices building more secure software in their projects that matters to them. Our friends at OpenChain has released a new playbook targeted to small companies to help these organizations adopt the ISO standards through the lens of the OSPO. The Tutor Group has released its fifth OSPO survey. For those who are unaware of this research, we have been conducting this survey over the past 5 years that aims to get a pulse of the OSPO adoption worldwide. Next, in October, we're going to be organizing in collaboration with other open source communities such as Chaos, OpenChain, OpenSSF, and XPDX, OSPOlogy.live workshop, hosted by OSPO at Ericsson. And the main goal of these workshops is to gather together, share experiences, and find new solutions. So, for instance, creating new guides or building a new working group or group of interest around a certain topic. And another cool stuff regarding OSPO networking, there is a new framework to allocate OSPO local meetups on different regions. We are proud to announce that the OSPO local meetup for Western Switzerland in French has been just published. If you're in Switzerland and you speak French, you can go and find more details in the link. Friendly reminder that Open Source Summit Japan is near. Also, new OSPO discussions in the OSPO forum. Tutor Group exists thanks to the community and its valuable contributions. So if you would like to become one Tutor contributors, you can do so joining the work days. If you're new to the community, I really recommend you to take a look into the OSPOlogy repo and the many ways you can become a contributor. This session is going to be recorded, and we have an OSPOlogy YouTube channel where people can deep dive into past sessions with other topics. And saying this, let's move now to the topic of the month. So today we have great panelists, Don Foster from OSPO at VMware, Singh Goggins from University of Missouri and also part of the Chaos, Daniel Izquierdo, CEO at Vitergia and also from the Chaos project, Mike Nolan from Research Institute of Technology, and Matt will be moderating and facilitating the panel. Matt, over to you.
All right, thank you, Anna. So hi, everybody. I'm Matt German-Prey, and it's really great to be here. And for those of you that don't know, the Chaos project it's an open source community that develops metrics, practices, and software for making open source project health more understandable. Like Anna said, we're really excited to have everybody here. And I'd say let's just get started with the questions. And so the first question that we have, and I'm going to pose this to Dawn and to Daniel, is what is your involvement with open source program offices? And how have you seen them change over the last few years?
Yeah, I can start with that one. So I do work at VMware's open source program office. So I run our open source community strategy team. So we do things like open source project health, amongst a few other things. But open source program offices, I think the important thing to know about open source program office is that they are all different. So I'll talk a little bit about how I've seen them change over the last few years, but it certainly doesn't apply to all of the open source program offices. But the biggest trend that I think I've seen in open source program offices is that a lot of them started really focused on the legal and compliance side, which is super important, which is a great place to start for an open source program office. But the shift that I've seen in the last few years, and in particular recently, is a more strategic approach. So not just looking at license and compliance, but looking at more strategic aspects of open source program offices. So things like, how do you incorporate open source into your strategy? How do you generate alignment for your open source contributions across, your entire company and all of your business units. So I see this more strategic approach, and I see this also tying into the metrics as well. So, if I look at the metrics that we used to gather in open source program offices a while ago, it was a lot of counting things, right? So it was like counting commits and mailing list posts, and some of the metrics that we used weren't particularly sophisticated. And now we have, a lot more tools available to us, and you see people doing really interesting things like, machine learning to better understand the differences between, what's happening with, something new that might be happening that you might not otherwise discover within an open source program office, or network analysis. And so we're seeing a lot of more sophisticated metrics, I think, coming out of the open source program offices as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Don. Indeed, my experience specifically with OSPOs is in this case through consultancy. So as part of Vitergia and involved in the chaos community, it's like we've seen how the need for new metrics and new services on the OSPO ecosystem has been kind of growing, let's say. And when at the very beginning was mainly compliance, and if you remember companies like Black and others, they were basically focused on that thing. Now with the let's say the last years and so on, first there is like an explosion of OSPOs all around the world, of course, thanks to movements as the To Do group, definitely, that are kind of socializing that aspect of the strategy you need to have within large corporations. But at the same time, people and companies are realizing that if you want to consume and even produce open source, then you need to deal with some more things, and those things are basically community. Those things are about learning, for instance, how to work in the open, or even the value of working in the open. And perhaps from a more services perspective, what corporations are asking for these days are what you mentioned specifically, Don, is like, okay, I need to understand what open source is, and not only from a risk perspective, like pure compliance, but from a community perspective. For instance, in chaos, one of the metrics, or part of the metrics that we are dealing with, are to understand the evolution of those metrics, or to understand the diversity of those communities, or to analyze the value or the risk of certain aspects. And with all of this, let's say that in chaos we are building this body of knowledge about understanding open source projects and ecosystems as a whole that is pretty important. So that's more or less my approach to the OSPO world.
Great, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Don. Let's move to Sean and Mike. I'll pose the next question. I'll put it here in the chat as well. So, what role do you think metrics play in how open source program offices operate? I think both Don and Daniel touched on this. And then for both of you, is there a particular story you could tell us about the relationship between OSPOs and metrics? Sean, you're muted.
Yeah, I saw that. When I think about OSPOs and metrics, I think, echoing what Don said a minute ago, a few years ago, it was pretty focused on the legal and compliance requirements. And now I see a lot of OSPOs trying to understand the dependencies inside their internal tool chains so that they can mitigate risk, but also do something creative with it. And I think the role of metrics are, I think, the clay of an OSPO. They are something that you can measure, but which metrics are important will vary over time and perhaps by context.
Yeah. I was going to just real quickly to follow up with Sean. Is there a story? Have you seen this in practice? You don't have to name names or anything.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly worked with a number of companies without naming names, and some. I think especially when I've worked with companies during merger and acquisition kinds of things, licensing and contribution levels per project have been important questions. But as those same companies evolve over time, what they're really trying to understand is how do they nurture projects that are important to them? What are the right levers to push? And so one company is looking to give money to open source projects, 10 projects per quarter. Another company is trying to understand which projects have newcomer engagement that's very effective. And so each of those problem spaces has a different oeuvre of metrics that you would apply.
Great. Thank you, Sean. Mike, sorry about that.
No worries. Yeah, I largely agree with what everyone else said. As I'm sure everyone here is aware of, OSPOs are quite heterogeneous in how they are formed, and they have lots of different roles. They are in different places organizationally, and they're also in lots of different types of organizations now, coming from an academic institution that has an open programs office, but also governments are championing these types of things. And so I think with that, the role metrics will play within any individual office will change drastically. And also the relation of metrics to other sorts of ways of evaluating performance and success will also change. I know, for instance, in tenure and promotion cases within American academic institutions, metrics is very important. But oftentimes when pitching things to upper administration, actually narratives and storytelling is really important. And so the role of metrics play in that, and sort of allowing you to have punchy narratives that are believable by backing them up with certain numbers, and how you do that really changes about like kind of what you're trying to measure and so on. In terms of I saw you unmute, in terms of a particular story that I could tell about this relationship for us, I would say, one thing that I think drives this home for us is a lot, speaking with people in the private sector, a lot of great organizations have championed the creation of an OSPO in a really strategic way. Right. So a company said open source is important to us. We know it's important, and we know we're contributing to it and creating it. We need to actually build some organizational capacity to facilitate this in a more structured way. In academia, that's not the case at all. I mean, I don't want to speak for every university, but a lot of the calling for more support around open source comes from donors. So whether it's the NSF wanting to fund more open source code production, or foundations like the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which are funding a lot of OSPOs within American institutions. And what this means is, because these funders are funding research, the kind of metrics that we're thinking about that we want to measure and we want to utilize really has to do with the impact of individual researchers and how they're collaborating across lines, utilizing open source methodologies, and understanding how to showcase that. And, that could be entirely different than what maybe like the folks at VMware are doing, or another institution.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Just for the panelists too, if you see in the Q&A section, there are some questions that are showing up. So, while still talking, you can kind of look ahead as we get towards the end of the panel of questions that you might want to address. I'm going to move to the third question here, and I'll put it in chat. So this is back to Dawn and to Sean. So do you see challenges in how organizations are relying on and using metrics, particularly around their use with developers or managers or with executive teams? Again, challenges. So Dawn, I'll start with you.
Yeah, this is something that I've seen a lot within, not just within VMware, but really within every company I've worked for. As a community manager, the kind of the first time I brought open source metrics into a company, what I really quickly learned was that those really complicated dashboards that were amazing for me as a community person, where I could just dig into any level of detail I wanted to, were fabulous for me and not good for anybody else. Because what happens is people just get lost in the metrics. They don't know what to pay attention to. They don't know how to use the tools. They really don't know what to focus on. So I think while like the really complicated detailed tools, like what we have in the CHAOSS project, like the Grimoire Lab tools, for example, are fabulous for community managers, but there has to be a level of translation for everyone else. The way I've done this at VMware is I'm using the Augur tool, but I'm only using the database, and I'm generating 4 charts that I think are important for every project. And they're 4 charts that anybody can really easily consume and understand. So those are the charts that, you know, the developers, the managers, the executives can really get kind of a snapshot of what's going on. And then I think too, if you're a community manager for a particular project, you can dig into those detailed metrics and pull out a few insights that you can share with your executives, developers, and managers. But you really probably don't want to share the entire dashboard unless you've got a really special person who knows what to do with it and can dig into it.
Great. Thank you, Don. Sean, do you have thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, I think the main challenge with metrics that I've seen over the years is just making sure that you're providing metrics that help you get a sense of the health of the projects that you care about. Where I think metrics can get a little bit challenging is when you try to cross that line to use them to evaluate individuals. And I think that, you know, if you compare, for example, 2 individuals on different projects, that is probably not a useful comparison. So if you don't put the context of what's actually happening and what each individual has been asked to do, you can go off the rails very quickly. But if you're trying to understand the health of an ecosystem, I think those are the kinds of things to focus your questions on.
And just to add to that, I had some friends at a very large company that their executives in the corporate office measured them on commits. And they would get emails that would be things like, you have fewer commits than last month, what happened? And they compared each other, you know, compared the developers against each other based on just number of commits. That was it. And so the developers were just like making as small of commits as they possibly could so that they would then have more of them, so their numbers would go up for corporate, which is just not encouraging good behavior.
Yeah, just to echo what is being said from an academic point of view, this is a long issue, especially within the last couple of decades. If you've ever heard of the term p-hacking to, you know, analyze impact or H scores within promotion cases where it's like, you know, this is the amount of things that you've published. The gaming of these metrics has been, you know, pretty rife throughout academia and has been a big problem. At an event that we held at RIT that we'll be publishing the videos for very, very soon, like within the next week, there was a talk done by Roberto De Cosmo on this exact issue and talked about the utilization of also like narratives alongside metrics as a really key way of, you know, actually telling the stories about what happened and differentiating between whether someone is just doing lots of tiny commits to show impact, or if they're actually being successful in collaborating and making something useful to lots of people. So I'll make sure that goes out to the OSPO++, or sorry, the to-do group list. Sorry, Freudian slip there.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Cool, thanks, Mike. And Daniel, I saw you had also put up your hand. Did you have a comment that you wanted to make?
Yeah, I wanted to start here, and probably you've had this experience as well in the past, is when you discuss about metrics, probably the very first question we have on the table on our side, let's say, is what is the purpose of doing this? What is the purpose of the OSPO? And there are cases where people start doing OSPOs because they want to become even just cool outside. There is a talent war, right? So it's about bringing the right talent, the right people to the company. But there are other cases where they want to produce open source in the right way. So there are many reasons why you have an OSPO, right? And by understanding those business goals is when you can then start having the discussion about what are the right metrics that can match those business goals. Because if not, then it's what Don mentioned is, okay, we are measuring these metrics because we can measure that because someone gave me the numbers, but maybe measuring commits doesn't make sense at all. So the thing is, and in the same way, we are following the same method we are following in chaos, the goal question metric approach, something, you know, done in the industry for years, for decades, that helps, you know, to divide and conquer. And for this really high level business goal, try to split this into different questions, so then you can answer those questions with metrics. And then, of course, the business goals will evolve. So whatever you are trying to follow or to achieve today, it's going to be different from the next year, because the industry changes, the general politics environment, whatever change. So whatever you are going to focus today is going to be different from the next day. So try to, perhaps an advice we try to give everyone is to first document the metrics you are gathering, how you have reached to those metrics through the goal question metric approach, and then move forward to the next business goals that you want to have in the organization. So having those business goals really clear and how those go down into the hierarchy to metrics, that's something to do, because then you know where the storyline goes. Basically, you are having metrics that make sense to your business.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for your thoughts on this. We're at the last question. So this is to kind of have you look a little bit to the future. So the first question was kind of how things have evolved. I think the middle set of questions are kind of where are we at now? And this last question is really about, what you see the future role of metrics playing and how we improve our understanding of health and sustainability of the communities we care about. So I had Daniel and Mike for this question, but if all four of you want to give input, that's also completely excellent.
Mike, if you want to go first.
Sure. Yeah. It's kind of a big question. I mean, I think largely from my point of view, it's the expansion of what we can measure and how we're measuring it. And that expansion will require lots of infrastructure to do so, right? We'll need to be able to connect systems together and generate new metrics. This obviously is very biased from me. At RIT, we don't just do open source work. We work with any type of open work. So maybe like open access publishing or open data sets. And having metrics to understand community and health across all types of work and understand how they're connected together to get a bigger picture is kind of where I see the immediate, next 5-10 years for metrics from my point of view.
Great, thanks, Mike. Daniel, do you have thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, in my case, what I would say is that if you think about the software development life cycle in corporations, and maybe software development at universities and other environments, metrics in software engineering is something that happens. So there are maintenance metrics. There are even CI/CD metrics related to the Accelerate book that probably you all know. But open source metrics are not that much found in those ecosystems. But when you are producing development, or when you are producing software, you are in somehow adopting open source software. So somehow you need to include those metrics into your production chain at some point. An example here is if we think, I know, perhaps you're choose another project, OpenStack, and then you start thinking about how long does it take to bring a new feature to internal stakeholders within your corporation, because you are using this for your private cloud, for instance. The question is, how long does it take in the open to fix a bug, to get things reviewed, to do certain things in the open, so then you can include those into your production chain and software engineering metrics. And that's something that I think we are still missing. So the future of those metrics, open source health and so on, I see those entering into that space.
Yeah, I would echo what Daniel's saying. I've seen, I've been asked how does open source process compare to a software engineering process inside of an organization, and the short answer is it really doesn't. And so understanding the metrics that can be used to determine or estimate the stability and sustainability of an open source project is right now a different activity. It's separate from how you might think of your own software construction process. And to Daniel's point, I think bringing these kinds of metrics bringing software engineering focused metrics into open source is, I think, part of what CHAOSS has been doing, and also will be a bigger effort in the future.
Dawn,
yeah, I also, the other piece that I see as kind of the future role that metrics can play is really really having a much bigger focus on project health. And I know this isn't the question, project health and sustainability, but sustainability is a big issue right now for a lot of projects. This is something we talk about. I work on the CNCF Contributor Strategy Technical Advisory Group. And we see this a lot with CNCF projects where there aren't enough maintainers on projects. Those maintainers are burnt out, and we don't have a good pipeline of new people coming into these projects who can eventually take over for them. And so sustainability of projects, I think, has been increasingly a problem. And so I think we can use metrics, though, to help us determine whether a project is healthy, what are the areas that are not healthy and could be improved, and how do we use some of those metrics to do things like look at sustainability. So who are some of the new up and coming people that maybe you can mentor and provide some assistance to and grow them into leaders? And how do you find those people? How do you keep people from leaving? How do you analyze a project for sustainability over time?
We are at the end of our questions. Anna, do you want to?
Yeah. So I just wanted to also mention that there is one new that we haven't said yet, and is that CHAOSS has become an OSPO associate. And what does it mean? This is an effort we are doing both communities to see how can we bring OSPO metrics and standards into the OSPO community. Things with CHAOSS expertise, and also the community of open source program office leaders and practitioners in the community. We're starting with this repo that needs to be redefined. So right now is the working group value, but it's going to be called OSPO Working Group. It's going to be hosted under CHAOSS. We would like to welcome the community to start adding new ideas, maybe some wish list of OSPO metrics that you would like to see being developed, or feature requests for the existing CHAOSS tooling to be adapted to OSPO needs, and maybe try to gather together some best practices that open source program offices can take to measure the value of the OSPO for their organization. You will be hearing news soon. And as I said, you can start using that channel to submit an issue and request for new ideas or topics that you had in mind. So both communities can be in the loop and start making efforts. So I don't know, Matt, if you want to add
I was
something.
typing great. I said great overview. Thank you. And then I didn't send it because you ended. So that's a great overview. So yes, we are making this change. We'd encourage you to join. I think there's some structural work that we're doing kind of at the moment. But certainly we learn from the people who join the talks, and we try to document and get that work out there for everybody. So hopefully you can join.